I can still hear it. The static that ate our voices. The frequency that turned words into gravel. I was Vox Bearer Amon Chris, Senior Communications Operator aboard the Undaunted Resolve. For 11 years I listened to the void. I learned which frequencies carried truth and which carried contagion. Then something learned to speak with the Imperium's voice. It called for help. Identical transmissions, perfect repetition, inhuman precision. Commander Vrail ordered silence, then obedience, then sacrifice. He became the hero they sing about now, the man who saved 17 systems. But I heard the waveforms, I analyzed the signal. We didn't seal the rift, we answered it. They logged my final transmission as background noise. Reactor malfunction, nothing more. My service record is sealed, my warnings erased, and the void is still learning, still practicing our voice. The Imperium will answer when it calls again. It always does. I can still hear it when I close my eyes. The static hiss that ate our voices, the carrier wave that turned every word into gravel. The Vox unit in my quarters hums the same frequency now, though it hasn't worked in 3 years. I wake to that sound. I taste copper when it peaks. The Medicae say it's nerve damage from the radiation exposure, but they're wrong. It's memory. It's what remains when the Imperium decides you've said enough. My name is Vox Bearer Amon Chris, though that title means nothing now. I was the Senior Communications Operator aboard the Undaunted Resolve, a Cobra-class destroyer assigned to patrol the coral margin, where the warp storms breathe like lungs and the dead stars flicker messages no human should read. We were a listening post with engines, and I was the ear pressed against the universe's throat. For 11 years I transcribed distress calls, rogue trader beacons, Imperial Navy command traffic, and the occasional screaming void hymn from something that had never been human. I learned to filter meaning from madness. I learned which frequencies carried truth and which carried contagion. I learned too late that the Imperium doesn't always want the truth transcribed. It started 4 months before the incident. The Administratum now calls incident margin theta 9, status resolved, casualty rating acceptable. 4 months before Commander Tanok Vrail became the hero they sing about in the officer academies, the man who saved 17 systems by sealing a warp rift with nothing but faith and fury. 4 months before I understood that heroism is just martyrdom with better lighting. The first anomaly came through at 0800 hours shipboard time, local designation day 217 of our patrol cycle. I was alone in the primary Vox chamber, a spherical room 30 meters across, walls lined with receiver arrays that clicked and hummed like a billion insects trapped in amber. The air tasted like ozone and old incense. My station hung suspended in the chamber's center, a cradle of cables and cogitator screens, and I floated there in the semi-darkness, listening to the void's constant whisper. The frequency was 88, 3 megahertz low-band commercial, the kind used by ore haulers and pilgrim ships too poor to afford encrypted channels. The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking low Gothic with a manufacturing worker's accent. He was calling for help. His ship, the Blessed Endurance, had suffered engine failure in the outer approaches of the Morast system. 1,400 souls aboard, life support failing. Standard distress call. I logged it, assigned it a priority rating and forwarded it to the duty officer. 3 minutes later, the same call came through again. Identical. Same voice, same cadence, same background noise. A child crying, a woman praying, the groan of overstressed metal. But the timestamp was different. The first call had originated 8 hours ago. This one was marked as real time. I ran a signal analysis. The waveforms matched perfectly, not similar. Identical down to the subharmonic frequencies that human vocal cords can't help but vary. I checked the third call when it arrived 6 minutes later, and the fourth 3 minutes after that. Always the same, always desperate, always exactly the same. I reported it to Senior Lieutenant Marek, the communications officer on duty rotation. He was a thin man with burn scars on his hands from a plasma conduit rupture years before, and he had the kind of exhaustion in his eyes that comes from seeing too many unanswered distress calls. He listened to my report, reviewed the logs, and told me to triangulate the source. I did. The signal wasn't coming from the Morast system, it was coming from a point in space where our charts showed nothing. No stars, no planets, no registered shipping lanes. Just void. Empty, absolute void. Marek ordered me to continue monitoring but take no action. He would consult with the captain. I returned to my station and listened as the calls continued, now arriving every 90 seconds. The man's voice never wavered. The child never stopped crying. The woman's prayer never changed. Somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part of me that had listened to the void for 11 years, I understood that I wasn't hearing a distress call. I was hearing an echo. Something was playing the signal back at us, testing to see if we would respond. By the time Marek returned 4 hours later, the calls were arriving every 30 seconds. The frequency had drifted slightly, creeping up from 88. 3 to 88. 7 megahertz, and the voice had developed a wet, bubbling quality, as if the speaker were drowning. Marek's face was grey. He told me Commander Vrail had ordered a communications blackout on all frequencies below 100 megahertz until further notice. We were not to acknowledge the signal. We were not to triangulate further. We were to log it as background noise and continue standard operations. I asked why. He didn't answer. He just stared at the Vox screens, at the waveform patterns that now looked less like speech and more like a heartbeat, and then he left. I never saw him alive again. The blackout lasted 16 days. During that time, the signal continued. It evolved. The man's voice dropped away, replaced by the child's crying, which stretched and deepened until it no longer sounded like a child, but like something vast and ancient imitating the memory of distress. The woman's prayer inverted, the words running backward, and when I played it in reverse, it wasn't low Gothic anymore. It was a language I didn't recognize, but my teeth ached when I heard it, and the Vox screens flickered with frost. Commander Vrail held briefings every 6 hours in the officers' chapel, a narrow chamber beneath the bridge where a bronze Aquila watched with empty eyes. I attended as required, standing in the back with the other enlisted Vox bearers, while the officers knelt and the ship's confessor militant, a woman named Isara Nen, spoke about duty and faith and the Emperor's protection. Vrail stood at the front, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid, and he told us that we were witnessing a test. The enemy was probing our resolve. We would not break. We would not respond. We would continue our mission. He never said what the enemy was. He never explained why a distress call was a test. And he never mentioned that 3 crew members had disappeared from the lower decks, or that the ship's navigator had locked herself in her sanctum and refused to open the door, or that the Medici had reported a spike in cases of insomnia, auditory hallucinations, and unexplained bruising that looked like handprints. On the 17th day, the blackout ended. Marek was found in his quarters, his wrists opened with a monomolecular scalpel, his blood used to write coordinates on the walls, coordinates that matched the source of the signal. The administratum officer aboard, a dour woman named Vanis Cole, declared it a case of acute void sickness and ordered his body incinerated within the hour. She also ordered me to assume Marek's duties as senior communications officer. I was 27 years old. I had been in the void for 11 years, but I had never been responsible for deciding which transmissions mattered and which didn't. The signal had stopped. The frequencies below 100 megahertz were silent. For 2 days we sailed through normal operations, and I began to believe that whatever had been testing us had moved on. Then, on the 19th day, a new call came through. This one was Imperial Navy command traffic, authenticated, encrypted, marked priority absolute. The voice belonged to Admiral Kesha Morn, commander of the Segmentum battle group we reported to, and she was ordering us to proceed immediately to the coordinates where the distress signal had originated. A warp rift had been detected, multiple ships were converging. The undaunted resolve was to join the fleet and await further orders. Commander Vril received the transmission personally. I watched him listen, his face unchanging, and then he ordered the navigator released from her sanctum and the ship's course altered. We would reach the coordinates in 47 hours at maximum real space velocity. The crew's mood shifted. There was relief, purpose, the sense that the waiting was over and now we would act. The Confessor Militant held a service of thanksgiving. Rations were increased. Vril walked the decks, speaking to enlisted crew by name, and for the first time in weeks, I saw people smile. I should have felt the same, but I had listened to the Admiral's voice, and I had analyzed the waveforms, and I knew. The signal wasn't identical to previous command transmissions from Admiral Morn. It was identical to the distress call. The same perfect repetition, the same inhuman precision. Something was still testing us. And this time, we were responding. I went to Venice Cole. She received me in her quarters, a small, sterile chamber filled with data slates and purity seals. I explained my analysis. I showed her the waveform comparisons. I told her that the order might not be real, that we might be sailing toward the source of the contagion, not away from it. She listened. Then she asked me if I was questioning the Admiral's authority. I said no, I was questioning the signal's authenticity. She asked me if I was suggesting Commander Vril was incompetent. I said no, I was suggesting he might have been deceived. She asked me if I understood what happened to crew members who sowed doubt during a crisis. I said I understood, but my duty was to report what I heard. She smiled. It was a thin, bureaucratic smile, the kind that appears on faces in the administratum right before they stamp a form that ruins your life. She told me that my analysis had been noted and would be included in the official logs. She also told me that I was confined to quarters for the next 72 hours for my own mental health, and that any further discussion of the matter would be considered sedition. I was escorted to my quarters by 2 armsmen, the door locked from the outside. I sat on my cot and listened to the ship's engines change pitch as we accelerated. The Vox unit on my wall, the one that hadn't worked in years, began to hum, softly at first, then louder, until the whole room vibrated with it. I covered my ears, but the sound came through my bones. I tasted copper. The lights flickered, and for a moment I saw frost forming on the walls in patterns that looked like words. I don't remember what they said. My mind slides away from it the way you can't look directly at the sun. But I remember understanding, in that moment, that we were already lost, that whatever Vril thought he was doing, whatever heroism he believed he was enacting, it didn't matter. We were sailing into the throat of something that had learned to speak with the Imperium's voice, and we would never come back. 47 hours later, the ship arrived at the coordinates. I was still confined to quarters, but I could hear the Vox traffic through the walls, the sudden surge of activity as the augurs detected ships, dozens of them, hundreds, a fleet assembling around a wound in space that the navigator later described as a scream made visible. Vril ordered battle stations. The crew moved with the smooth efficiency of the well-drilled, and for a few minutes it was almost possible to believe we were part of something glorious, something necessary. Then the warp rift opened fully, and the ships began to sing. Not distress calls, not commands. Just song, wordless and vast, a choir of frequencies that made the Vox arrays overload, and the crew members nearest the receivers start bleeding from their eyes. I heard it through the walls, through the bones of the ship itself, and I understood that every vessel out there, every destroyer, cruiser, transport and escort, was transmitting the same signal, perfectly synchronized, perfectly inhuman. Vril's voice came over the ship-wide Vox, calm and resolute. He told us that the enemy was attempting to corrupt our machine spirits, that the tech adepts were already enacting countermeasures, that we would hold the line until reinforcements arrived. He told us that the Emperor protects, and that every soul aboard the Undaunted Resolve would be remembered as heroes. I started laughing. I couldn't stop. The armsman outside my door shouted for me to be quiet, but I laughed until my throat bled, because I understood the truth. There were no reinforcements. There was no enemy, not in the way Vrael imagined. The rift wasn't a wound we were sealing. It was a mouth. And we had sailed directly into it, because something out there had learned to speak the Imperium's language perfectly, and the Imperium always obeys its own voice. The ship shuddered. Explosions bloomed across the fleet as vessels fired on each other, their targeting systems subverted, their crews still believing they were following orders. The Undaunted Resolve launched torpedoes at a cruiser to our starboard, and I heard Vrael shouting targeting solutions, his voice ecstatic with purpose. He thought he was fighting. He thought this was the moment his name would be etched into history. The door to my quarters opened. Confessor Militant Isara Nen stood in the threshold, her face streaked with ash and blood. She told me I was needed in the primary Vox chamber. The senior tech adept believed there was a way to transmit a counter-signal to disrupt the enemy's synchronization. I would need to boost the signal manually from inside the chamber while the ship's reactors were diverted to the Vox arrays. It would likely kill me. The radiation exposure alone would be lethal within minutes. I asked her if she believed it would work. She didn't answer. She just said that Commander Vrael had requested me specifically, that he believed I understood the enemy's transmissions better than anyone, and that my sacrifice would be honored. I followed her. Not because I believed it would work, not because I thought I was a hero, but because I wanted to be in the Vox chamber when the end came, surrounded by the only thing I had ever truly understood, the sound of the void. The corridors were chaos. Crew members ran in all directions, some toward their stations, some away from fires, some just running. The ship groaned like a dying animal. I passed viewports that showed the fleet tearing itself apart, ships spinning in death spirals, debris clouds glittering with frozen bodies. And through it all, the singing continued, louder now, so loud that the bulkheads vibrated and my teeth felt loose in my jaw. The Vox chamber was a ruin. Half the receiver arrays had exploded, their components fused into blackened sculptures. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning insulation. The tech adept, a hunched figure whose name I never learned, worked frantically at the central console, attaching cables and chanting litanies to machine spirits that no longer listened. Vrael stood nearby, his uniform scorched, his face alight with terrible certainty. When he saw me, he smiled. He told me I was going to save them all. He told me that the counter-signal was ready, that all I had to do was activate it and hold the transmission for 60 seconds while the warp rift destabilized. He told me that Saint Designate Caldron Vox himself had once performed a similar feat, sacrificing his life to save an entire sector, and that my name would be spoken in the same breath. I looked at the console. The waveform displayed there wasn't a counter-signal. It was the same signal we had been receiving for months, amplified to lethal intensity. The tech adept wasn't building a weapon, he was building a beacon. Vrael wasn't sealing the rift, he was calling to it. I asked him if he knew, if he understood what he was doing. He stared at me, his eyes bright with faith and madness, and he said of course he knew. The God Emperor had shown him the way. The rift would close when it heard the voice of the faithful, transmitted on a frequency that only the pure could reach. All it required was sacrifice. All it required was one willing soul to stand at the threshold and scream into the dark. I realized then that Vrael had gone mad weeks ago, probably the moment the first distress call arrived, and Vanis Kol had known, and the Confessor Militant had known, and none of them had stopped him, because the Imperium values certainty over truth, and a mad commander who believes he's a hero is more useful than a sane one who might hesitate. I could have refused. I could have walked away, Let the ship die. Let Vrail's madness consume him and everyone aboard. But I didn't, not because I was brave, not because I believed, but because I had spent 11 years listening to the void, and I wanted, just once, to speak back. I activated the console. The signal flooded through me, a frequency so intense that my skin began to blister, and my vision went white. I felt my voice box vibrate, felt words I didn't choose pour out of me, felt the Vox arrays amplify them into a shriek that could be heard across the entire fleet. For 60 seconds, I was the loudest thing in the void. For 60 seconds, I was the voice of the Imperium. Then the rift swallowed us. I woke 3 months later in a Medicaid facility on a station whose name I was not permitted to know. Vanis Cole visited once. She told me that Commander Tanok Vrail was a hero. She told me that his sacrifice had sealed the warp rift, saving 17 systems from demonic incursion. She told me that his name would be immortalized, that his statue would stand in the Hall of Martyrs, that every officer cadet would study his final stand. She told me that I had been exposed to fatal levels of radiation and would likely be dead within a year. She told me that my service record had been sealed under administrative authority and that I was forbidden from discussing the events of Incident Margin Theta 9 with anyone under penalty of execution. She told me that my final transmission had been logged as background noise, a side effect of the ship's reactor overload, nothing more. She told me that I should be proud. I live now in a hospice on the edge of a hive city, in a room with a broken Vox unit that hums at 88, 3 megahertz. I listen to it every night. Sometimes I hear the man calling for help. Sometimes I hear the child crying. Sometimes I hear my own voice screaming into the dark, and something screaming back. The Medicaid were wrong. I'm not dying from radiation. I'm dying because I heard what was on the other side of that signal, and it heard me, and now it knows exactly what frequency humanity transmits on. It's learning, it's practicing, and one day it will call again, and the Imperium will answer, because the Imperium always answers its own voice. I tried to tell them, I tried to make them understand, but I'm just background noise now, a distorted signal logged and forgotten. And when the next Commander Vrail hears the call, when the next fleet assembles, when the next Vox bearer is ordered to sacrifice themselves for a lie wrapped in faith, they'll go willingly. They'll believe they're heroes.